The last sound Shelley Rockwell Martin remembered before everything went wrong was the coffee settling in the pot, one last soft domestic burble, followed by the kind of silence you don't notice until it's already too late to pretend it's normal. Upstairs in the master bedroom, she lay on top of the quilt with her husband and her daughter, fully dressed, shoes still on. Nobody spoke. They were listening to the house the way people listen to an unfamiliar animal. Careful, trying not to make it feel cornered. A slow scrape moved along the outside wall below the window. Not the sharp tick-tick of a branch in wind, not the quick scuttle of raccoons. This was heavy and deliberate, like a body being dragged in increments, pausing, shifting its weight, deciding. Then something exhaled. The curtain barely stirred. Shelley kept her eyes fixed on the fabric because looking felt like an invitation, because the glass was right there, thin as a held breath, and she could not shake the thought that whatever was outside understood the idea of a window, understood what a barrier was and what it meant to test it. A shape pressed up to the pane, not fully visible, only the faint change in the curtain's drape, the smallest bulge of presence, as if something had stood tall enough to bring its face level with the second-floor glass. Eric's hand found hers. His grip had that desperate clarity of someone trying to be the only wall left. Shelley's throat tightened around a prayer she didn't believe in until that moment. Below them, the porch creaked once, twice, slow footfalls circling the house in a patient loop. And in that patience, in that waiting, was the worst part. Because predators rushed, drunks shouted, teenagers broke things for fun. But whatever was outside their home that night, whatever had stared from the field and then slipped closer until the house felt like a lantern set down in the middle of a dark sea, moved as if it had all the time in the world, as if it had done this before. A year earlier, the Martins had been living a life that made sense. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even easy, but it was legible. Work meant money. Money meant mortgage payments. A weekday looked like the one before it. Their daughter, Chelsea, had her own weather, moods, plans, small storms, and that, too, was normal. Then Eric got hurt. It started with something mundane enough that people would later find it hard to treat the consequences with the seriousness they deserved. A workplace injury, a wrong reach, a sudden failure of the body that turned his spine into a source of constant negotiation. Pain has a way of rewriting a person's identity. It makes even a strong man feel like a hostage in his own skin. It teaches you, slowly and humiliatingly, how much of your pride was tied to simply being able to stand up and do what needed doing. The injury devastated him. It changed the math of their lives. Shelley left her job to take care of him, and the household shrank around the new center of gravity. Doctor appointments, bad nights, bills that arrived with a hard, confident finality. When the idea of less expensive became the only idea, Shelley did what she'd always done. She went looking for a practical answer and tried not to call it fear. Palmyra, Maine, wasn't a place people moved to on a whim. It wasn't on postcards. It didn't offer anything that could be described as a scene. It was rural, quiet, and cheap enough that you could buy land, real land, acres, without taking a second mortgage on your future. Shelley found an older farm there, a weathered farmhouse, a barn, and the kind of open field you only appreciate once you've lived pressed up against neighbors. The property was bordered by dense woods, thick enough that the tree line looked like a wall from the porch. The access road was rough. The driveway felt like a private corridor into a pocket of isolation. For the first time in months, the numbers worked. They moved. Chelsea wasn't eager. Teenagers rarely are when the destination is quiet and the internet feels farther away. But she went because the family went, because their choices had tightened, because the world lately had been teaching them that refusal didn't change the outcome. Eric tried to take some comfort in the size of the place. If he couldn't work, at least he could be somewhere that didn't feel like a cage. He came from hunters. He knew woods. He knew how to read dirt and wind and animal tracks, and he had always believed, without ever saying it out loud, that knowing the land was a kind of protection. But even on move-in day, that belief ran into an old argument. Eric had guns, a fairly extensive collection, the kind that had been normal in the family he came from. To him, they meant tradition, skill, a piece of the man he'd been before pain narrowed him. To Shelley, they meant risk in a house with a child and a husband whose temper could be shortened by suffering on the wrong day. They meant worst-case scenarios. They meant one more variable she didn't want living under the same roof. So she made a rule. No guns in the house. Eric, tired and sore and trying to be cooperative, agreed. With the help of his son, Sean, older, steadier, someone who still moved with the easy confidence Eric missed, Eric built a strong box in the barn and locked the weapons away. Then they locked the barn itself. The decision felt responsible. It felt adult. It felt like the kind of compromise people made when they wanted to keep their marriage intact. And if you'd asked Shelley then, she would have told you it helped her sleep. Their first months in Palmyra were defined by small things. The field needed mowing. The house had its own voice, old boards, an occasional knock in the walls when the temperature changed. The woods were always there, unmoving, like a long-held stare. At night, insects and distant animals made a low, constant life sound that Shelley found oddly comforting. It was proof the world was functioning. And slowly, without planning it, Eric and Shelley built a ritual. If it wasn't too cold, they'd take coffee out to the sheltered porch in the evening. Not a romantic gesture, not some manufactured movie moment, just a way to sit outside the house for a while without needing to do anything. Eric would watch the field and the tree line like a habit. Shelley would talk, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about what scared her, sometimes about how she didn't like the way the woods looked after dark. It was, in its own way, a rebuilding. Then one night, the routine cracked. They saw lights, not close. Far, past the field, down by the tree line in that dense wall of forest where there were no trails and no reason for anyone to be. Pulsating. Strange. Not the steady beam of a flashlight, not the sweep of headlights. More like a glow that brightened and dimmed as if breathing. Sean was visiting, and Eric, who still thought like a hunter, made the practical assumption. A poacher. Someone trespassing, looking for game, careless enough to do it on private land. Eric hated poachers. It wasn't just the legality. It was the disrespect. The idea of someone taking from your property without even the courtesy of asking. He and Sean went out across the field to investigate. As they approached the woods, the lights faded and disappeared, swallowed by trees. The field was open enough that they could see each other clearly. And yet the moment the tree line loomed closer, it felt like stepping toward something that didn't want to be seen. Inside the forest, the undergrowth was thick. Low limbs snagged at clothing. There was no path to follow, no line of easy retreat. Their own footsteps sounded too loud, each snapped twig an announcement. Eric had hunted in darkness before. He knew what it felt like to be quiet in the woods. But this was different. This had nothing to do with game. It felt in a way that embarrassed him to admit even in his own mind, like being watched by something that wasn't afraid of men. They didn't find anyone. They didn't find tracks. The lights were simply gone, and the woods closed around the absence like it had never been there. They returned to the house with their faces composed in the way men do when they're trying not to hand fear to the people they love. Shelley listened, arms crossed tight, and filed the story away as one more reason she didn't like the way the tree line looked at night. Not long after that, Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan Harth, came to visit. The winter had been long. Maine winters can make even a cheerful person feel trapped in a gray jar. When the weather finally softened, one of those first decent days where the air feels less like a warning, Chelsea and Nathan took the dogs and decided to walk. They crossed the field toward the same woods Eric and Sean had entered. In daylight, the tree line looked less like a wall and more like a border. The forest had color then, layers of green and brown. You could convince yourself it was normal. Chelsea let the dogs run. They bounded ahead and then stopped so suddenly it startled both of them. A dead halt, noses down, bodies stiff. When Chelsea and Nathan caught up, they saw what had arrested them. A large mound, more structure than earth, as if someone had leaned heavy pieces of wood together and packed moss and dirt over the frame. A den. The entrance was a round hole, too round. Nathan would later say it looked dug with care, shaped deliberately. The dogs sniffed, pushed their noses toward the dark opening, then recoiled and growled low. Nathan leaned closer. He couldn't see inside. The darkness seemed to eat the light, but he thought he heard something from within. A sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite wind, something that carried a warning you didn't need to translate. Chelsea had a bad feeling. Not the dramatic kind. The simple, bodily kind, your stomach tightening without permission. "Let's go," she told him. And her voice had that edge teenagers get when they're suddenly not playing anymore. Nathan hesitated only long enough to respect the instinct behind her words. Then he leashed the dogs and they left the woods quickly, glancing back more than once. Back at the farmhouse, they told Eric and Shelley what they'd found. Eric's expression changed in small increments. First skepticism, then attention, then something like reluctant recognition. Because it was in the same area, the same direction, the same stretch of forest, where the lights had appeared and vanished. The same place where, in the dark, he'd felt something move parallel to him without ever showing itself. For the first time since moving, the family began to share a quiet idea none of them wanted to say out loud: that the woods didn't feel empty. Memorial Day weekend arrived with a misty evening. The air was damp, cool enough that you could smell soil and old leaves. A low haze lay over the field like breath left behind. It should have been peaceful. It should have been the kind of night you remembered as quaint. But the dogs didn't want to go outside to their pen. They stood at the door, bodies angled away, as if the yard had become a place they couldn't afford to enter. These were hunting dogs. They weren't delicate. They'd chased scent through thorn and brush. Fear in them meant something. Shelley tried coaxing. Eric watched the dogs, then the field, then the tree line, and an unease began in him that had nothing to do with imagination. It was the silence. Normally the place hummed at night. Crickets, distant frogs, the small restless talk of living things. That evening, the land felt muted, as if the volume had been turned down. Shelley brewed their coffee anyway. Habits were a kind of defiance. They carried the mugs out to the porch. For a while, they talked about ordinary things. That's what people do when they're trying to keep ordinary in the room. They commented on the mist, on how the field looked like it belonged to someone else. Then Eric heard something. An odd sound from the distance, a rustle that didn't match the wind. His body reacted before his mind assembled a story. The hair on his arms rose. His chest tightened. Danger. Some old animal part of him insisted. He started to usher Shelley back inside. Not gently, urgently, like a man moving someone away from a ledge. Shelley resisted at first. She didn't want to be yanked around by fear, not after the year they'd had. But then she heard it too, rustling, closer now, and the unmistakable sense of multiple bodies moving in coordination. She lifted her bright flashlight and swept the beam across the field. At the end of the light, eyes. Not one pair, several. Yellow-green reflections, fixed and calm, staring back from the mist. For one heartbeat, Shelley's brain tried to label them the way it always had. Deer, maybe. The field had deer. Deer were normal. But deer didn't hold still like that. Deer didn't crouch low in the mist, as if they'd been crawling. And deer, when startled, bolted away. These shapes did something else. They rose, not all at once, but in a way that suggested a shared decision. The silhouettes pulled upward taller than they had any right to be. And for a brief, sick moment, Shelley could see that at least one of them was upright on two legs. Too long, too straight, its shoulders too high. Eric grabbed her arm. "Inside," he said, and he didn't wait for agreement. They slammed the door and locked it. The house, suddenly, felt too thin. Eric's first thought was the guns. They were in the barn, locked in the strongbox Sean had helped build. He could picture them precisely. Where they sat, how the lock turned. He could also picture the distance between the house and the barn, and the fact that his body didn't move fast anymore. Pain doesn't make you weaker in a simple way. It makes you slower. It makes every action require planning. Eric had spent a year learning how to do ordinary things carefully, so he wouldn't pay for them later. Now he stood in his own living room, realizing that careful was a luxury you lost when something outside wanted you. Shelley knew what he was thinking. "Don't," she said, and the word carried every argument they'd ever had about guns condensed into a plea. "Whatever it is, don't go out there." Upstairs, Chelsea was asleep. Shelley went to her room and woke her, trying to keep her voice calm, while her hands shook with the effort. Chelsea, groggy and annoyed, followed her mother to the window. Shelley didn't throw the curtains open. She made the smallest gap, the smallest invitation to look. Outside, near the driveway and the yard, 5 shapes lingered. They didn't scatter. They didn't prowl in the frantic way animals sometimes do when they're unsure. They stood, waiting. One of them looked up. Shelley felt the moment it happened, as if the creature's attention had weight. It straightened, rising onto its hind legs, and for a second, it seemed impossibly tall. An upright canine silhouette against the dim yard, large enough that Shelley's mind couldn't place it in the category of any animal she'd ever seen. Her breath caught. Her knees buckled. She sank back from the window like her body had chosen retreat without consulting her pride. Chelsea stared. Then, because teenagers are strange and denial is powerful, she faltered back toward the bed, as if sleep might solve the problem. Shelley wouldn't let her. "Stay away from the windows," she whispered fiercely. "Do you understand me? Don't go near them." Chelsea's face had lost its irritation now. Her eyes were wide in the way young people's eyes get when they realize adults don't have answers. Shelley left the room and moved through the upstairs, calling softly for the dogs. No response. She found them in a shadowed corner, huddled together, trembling. Hunting dogs reduced to shaking animals pressed against each other like children. If the dogs were afraid, Shelley thought, then fear wasn't optional. Downstairs, Eric paced. His frustration was raw and humiliating. He could feel his limitations like a second skin. A man's instinct to protect can become a kind of torment when you can't act on it. He looked through the blinds. For a moment, the creatures weren't where they'd been. The yard was empty. That was worse, because now he didn't know where to look. Then, through the mist and the shifting light, he spotted them farther out. In the field again, facing the house. The moon broke through briefly, pale illumination spreading across the open ground like a spotlight, and Eric could make out their shapes more clearly. Large, wolf-like bodies, but with a posture that didn't feel quite right. He thought, foolishly, dangerously, that if he could keep eyes on them, he might be able to reach the family vehicle and back it close enough for them to escape. Even with his disability, he told himself, he could do 20 feet, 10 meters. He could do that much. He didn't tell Shelley. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The night air hit him like cold water. The mist smelled like pond and grass. Somewhere out in the dark, something shifted. Eric kept his gaze pinned on the field. The shapes were still there, still facing the house. He moved down the steps, keys in hand, each step careful because pain punished him for sudden movement. He crossed toward the vehicle, trying not to hurry, trying not to stumble. Halfway there, the motion sensor light snapped on. The sudden brightness startled him so badly his fingers fumbled. The keys slipped. He froze, then looked instinctively toward the field. One of the creatures was no longer on all fours. It was upright, staring directly at him, as if the light had called its attention like a bell. Eric didn't bend for the keys right away. He couldn't. He watched as the other shapes began to move. They didn't scatter, they came forward. He grabbed the keys and turned, adrenaline fighting pain, and ran back toward the house as best he could. Gravel shifted under his feet. His breath tore in his chest. Behind him, he heard them crossing the yard, fast, heavy, coordinated. He got inside and slammed the door just as something bounded onto the porch. The boards outside thudded under weight. He didn't look through the window. He ducked instinctively, making himself smaller, as if they could see through glass if you offered them a clean outline. Upstairs, Shelley heard everything. The door slam, the sudden chaos, the unmistakable sound of multiple bodies on wood. "What's happening?" she called down, voice pitched between anger and fear. "Stay up there," Eric snapped. "Stay up there." For a long time, the family remained frozen in the house's center, listening to movement outside, footsteps circling the wraparound porch, the soft scrape of something brushing the wall, guttural sounds that didn't resolve into any animal call Shelley recognized. Then the steps moved away from the porch. Silence followed, brief, false. Eric lifted his head and, through a narrow gap in the blinds, saw them again. 5 shapes in the yard, facing the house in an eerily ordered patience. Not prowling, waiting. They called the police. Shelley tried to keep her voice steady because she knew how fear sounded on the phone, like hysteria, like something easy to dismiss. She described creatures on their property, 5 of them, large, surrounding the house. The response was what she should have expected, and yet couldn't emotionally accept. "Are you sure it isn't a moose?" the officer asked. "A bear?" Shelley insisted. She begged for a patrol car, if not to fight, then at least to bring headlights, to break whatever pattern the night had formed around their home. The officer told her, essentially, to lock the doors and close the windows. It would be fine. Nobody was coming. When she hung up, the click of the phone felt like abandonment. Eric's face darkened. The helplessness in him turned sour, as helplessness often does. Shelley tried to think in terms of what she could control. She moved through the house, making sure windows were shut, blinds down. She checked on Chelsea again and again. She kept the flashlight close. At some point, someone, Shelley would never remember exactly who, realized the creatures seemed wary of the bright light. The motion sensor had startled them. The flashlight had exposed them. Light wasn't protection, exactly. But it was something. Eric, driven by a need to do anything, considered going out again, trying to trigger the sensor and use that brief brightness as a shield to reach the barn. Shelley refused. She didn't shout. She didn't bargain. She simply stood in front of him with a look that made it clear she would rather fight him than let him step outside. "I'm not losing you to whatever this is," she said, voice low. "Not after everything." Eric's jaw flexed. He looked like a man swallowing his own rage. Outside, the noises shifted again. They weren't gone. They were close, so close that the sounds of rustling grass felt intimate, as if the yard had become another room and the walls were of paper. Shelley pulled Chelsea fully awake. If this was going to last, if they were going to endure it, she wanted her daughter conscious. She wanted eyes on the windows. She wanted all of them to understand that pretending it wasn't happening would not make it stop. They retreated to the master bedroom because it felt like the most defensible space, the place where they could be together. They lay on top of the bed, tense and dressed. The dogs pressed into the shadows. No one slept. Their muscles refused. The night moved around the house in phases. Sometimes there was motion on the porch, slow pacing, careful steps that made the boards talk. Sometimes there was silence so complete Shelley could hear her own blood. Then came the sound of weight shifting above, on the lower roofline, the section that ran beneath the second-story windows. It wasn't a crash, not a dramatic leap that broke shingles. It was more unsettling, a controlled climb, as if whatever was outside had mapped the house and understood how to gain height. Shelley stared at the curtain. She imagined paws braced on the sill. She imagined a muzzle pressed to glass, breath fogging the pain from inches away. At intervals, something moved past the window. It paused. Shelley could sense the attention, feel it pressed toward the room. The curtain trembled in the faint draft, and she understood with nauseating clarity how thin the barrier was between human safety and whatever existed on the other side of the glass. The creatures made low sounds, grunts, growls, something like communication. Not random animal noise, patterned, responsive, as if one called and another answered. Eric held his breath when the sounds got too near. Chelsea's eyes stayed open, unblinking, wide with the kind of fear that steals youth in minutes. Shelley kept a hand on the flashlight. Though she didn't click it on, light could reveal. Light could also invite attention. Hours passed. Time becomes strange when you're waiting for something to breach. Minutes feel like long corridors. The mind begins to narrate possibilities you don't want. Shelley thought about their first months here, about the way she'd stood on the porch and looked out at woods and told herself it was simply trees. She thought about the den Nathan and Chelsea had found and felt a cold shame at how quickly they'd accepted the idea that if they left it alone, it would leave them alone. Eric thought about the barn, about the strongbox, about the fact that he'd agreed to lock away his ability to defend his family because it seemed like the responsible compromise. Now responsibility felt like a trap. At some point in the night, the sounds shifted away from the house. The porch creaks stopped. The roof fell silent. Shelley didn't feel relief. She felt the dread of not knowing where they had gone. She strained to listen, and in the distance, out beyond the yard, she heard faint movement near the pond, the small farm pond that lay out in front of the house. Water makes its own subtle sounds at night, a ripple, the hush of disturbed lilies. Shelley had never paid attention to that before. Now her mind clung to it, trying to locate the creatures by any sign. When the sounds returned, they were close again, and the cycle of waiting resumed. Morning arrived the way it always does, indifferent and pale. The first light seeped into the room, turning the fear into something uglier. Exhaustion. Shelley didn't move for a long time. She lay still, listening, waiting for a final scrape, a final signal that the night hadn't truly ended. But the house stayed quiet. Eventually, Eric went downstairs, moving carefully, eyes sweeping every corner. He unlocked the front door and opened it into a world that looked normal enough to be insulting. Wet grass, brightening sky, mist lifting from the field. The creatures were gone. The relief wasn't clean. It came with a bitter edge, the knowledge that their absence didn't answer a single question. Eric called Sean, voice thick, and his son came over to help them look. It was easier with another person present, as if additional witnesses made the mourning more real. They searched the yard, the field, the edge near the pond. They found tracks, large ones, bigger than any normal canine should leave. Claws marked the soil in a way that made the prints look aggressive, like hands armed with knives they didn't need. There were indications, disturbed ground, signs of passage, that suggested something had moved through the wet grass and mud in the night, circling, approaching, retreating. They found strands of hair caught where something had brushed against the property, evidence that whatever had been there had mass, had fur, had reality. Shelley stared at the prints until her eyes burned. She wanted the shape of the truth, a label she could put on the terror. Bear, wolf, something sick with mange, something misread in darkness. But the memory of that upright silhouette, of eyes holding steady in the flashlight beam, of bodies rising from all fours into something too tall, wouldn't fit neatly into any category she knew. Neither would the way they had waited. Animals didn't hold a family hostage with patience, not like that. By afternoon, the field had dried a little. The tracks softened. Evidence began to fade, as if the land itself was erasing the night. Shelley stood on the porch with cold coffee in her hands and realized she could no longer pretend the farmhouse was simply a good deal in a cheap town. The property wasn't just isolated, it was exposed, and she couldn't raise her daughter in a place where the woods felt like an enemy with a face she couldn't name. They sold the house. They moved quickly, faster than people usually move when they're leaving a dream behind. They didn't linger. They didn't give it time. They didn't try to make meaning out of the experience by collecting more nights like that one. They chose distance. And in the years that followed, they didn't have another night like it. No 5 silhouettes in the mist. No slow footfalls on the porch. No heavy presence at the second-floor window. But terror doesn't always need repetition to persist. Sometimes it only needs a memory strong enough to become a reflex. Shelley would later find herself waking in the dark at the smallest sounds. Something shifting outside, wind brushing a wall, and for a moment her body would return to that bed in Palmyra, to the thin curtain and the glass, to the quiet knowledge that something intelligent had been outside, deciding. Eric, too, carried it in a way that was harder to speak about. Not just the fear of the creatures, but the humiliation of helplessness, the fact that he'd been unable to protect his family in the way he'd always assumed he would. They never learned what the creatures were. Were they wolves, misread in mist and adrenaline? Were they something rare? An anomaly of nature, a hungry pack, a wrong species in the wrong place? Or were they something that didn't fit cleanly into the world's normal inventory? The morning tracks had offered proof that something physical had been there. But physical evidence, in the end, is only the outline of a story. The residue, the part that stayed, was the waiting. The way the creatures had arranged themselves in the yard as if they understood doors. The way they climbed and circled as if they understood windows. The way they held their ground, unhurried, as though dawn was the only reason they ever left at all. And that is the thought Shelley could never fully scrub out. That if the sun hadn't risen when it did, if the night had been just a little longer, they might have eventually decided to stop waiting. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.